Hey, welcome to Date Night In. We're so glad that you decided to join us. My name is Jonathan. This is my beautiful wife, Emily, and our son.
Yeah, we're not sharing the name, remember?
Yeah, that's right. We agreed on that.
Yeah, I'm very bad at keeping secrets.
Well, if we know one thing is hard, it's being intentional with your spouse about date night. So we're really excited to share this evening with you.
Oh, yeah, we have an 18-month-old, so whatever time you put the kids to bed, earlier the better. If you give them the Xbox controllers, hey, you made it. We're happy to have you.
Yeah, if you're anything like us, you've been getting marriage advice since well before you were married, and some of it not so good.
Yeah, like saying you're sorry even if you don't mean it.
Yeah, that's bad advice.
It's awful advice. But luckily tonight is not about awful advice. It's about actual good advice.
Yeah, we've got Ted Lowe, who was the director of Married Life at North Point for about 10 years and is now the director of Married People and has authored a bunch of books on marriage. You're gonna love him.
Yeah, we had the opportunity to watch it, and it's gonna be a game changer for your marriage.
Yeah, you're gonna wanna discuss it. We even put together a couple of discussion questions for you to talk through afterwards. But for now, here's Ted Lowe.
For the next 20-ish minutes, I want to give you one thing that happy couples already do and any couple can learn. And let me start with some really good news. You're probably watching this because you care about your marriage. Maybe you want to take steps to make your marriage better, or you have this issue that you just can't seem to get past. Or maybe you're really tired of fighting under all the crazy pressures of life with things like financial stress, a worldwide pandemic, murder hornets, or fire tornadoes. Yes, in case you didn't know, fire tornadoes, yeah, that's a real thing now. And speaking of fire tornadoes, let me ask you a fiery, dangerous question. But when I ask you, don't say your answer out loud to your spouse. Don't look at your spouse. Don't elbow your spouse. Don't make that noise you make when your spouse frustrates you. Just don't. Okay, are you ready? Here it is. What is that thing your spouse does that triggers you? You may know immediately what that is. For those of you who don't, here are a few options. Money, sex, parenting, communication, and the biggest marital issue in North America, how to load a dishwasher. Yes, our spouse can trigger us. And this shouldn't come as a big surprise because our lives are so intertwined with our spouses. Almost everything our spouse does impacts us individually. The way they handle chores, emotion, communication, frustrations can all radically impact our lives. So when our spouse does something frustrating, when it's hurtful or it's just wrong, it triggers us. And it's so easy, watch this, even so natural to react without thinking. And here's the biggest problem. There can often be nothing between what triggers us and our reaction. Let me geek out on you for just a little bit with some neuroscience that explains what happens when you get triggered and why it is so easy to get into conflict. There's a set of structures in your brain called the limbic system. The limbic system is where your emotions begin. For all of you who think, wait a minute, I don't have an emotion. Yes, you do have an emotion. You have lots of them. If you've ever gotten frustrated or angry, you have emotions. So you're like, who knew? There is a part of the limbic system called the amygdala. When we are triggered by our spouse, the amygdala often jumps into action. The amygdala is responsible for sending us an alert that we aren't safe. This alert results in us taking steps to protect ourselves. And so the amygdala is a great thing. It's the part of our brain that makes us take our hand off a hot stove without having to think about it. We don't have to stop and say, ouch, this is hurting, like what I assume to be the second level of Hades, so I'll remove my hand from said pain. No, our amygdala is automatic, which serves us well when we need to protect ourselves from stoves and buses and wild boar and politics. But the fact is, when it comes to marriage, the amygdala is too efficient because we often react without thinking. And people typically tend to react in one of three ways: fight, flee, or freeze. If fighting is your thing, then when you're triggered, you tend to step toward the tension. If your thing is fight, then you typically step away from the tension. If you freeze, you freeze. Our amygdala reacts before consulting the part of our brain that's responsible for thought and judgment, which is called the cortex. This is the part of the brain that thinks and remembers logically that getting angry, it doesn't work, that issues are never resolved by fighting. It's the part of the brain that knows that hurting your spouse will not change their behavior. In fact, it often does the opposite. Just a couple of examples. Sometimes really neat, tidy people who want everything lined up, everything's got its place, everything in its place. Sometimes those types of people marry normal people. My wife is so neat, our junk drawer has dividers, which I tell her makes it by its very essence not a junk drawer. Sometimes savers marry spenders, and the savers rob joy from the spenders. That's how that works. But my wife, she thinks it's absolutely okay to postpone good things and good times. You may be thinking, why is he only choosing examples that trigger him about his wife and not what he does to trigger her? It's because I have a microphone that you can't see, and I asked her to be on this video and she declined. So that's kind of on her. Once again, the problem is we react without thinking because we're hardwired to do so. While this doesn't excuse things, it does help explain things. It explains why people who really want to be a good spouse find themselves doing and saying again that thing they promised that they would never do or say again. Knowing what is going on in your brain when you're having tension is such a good thing to know. I don't think most people know this. I didn't know this until a couple of years ago. Nobody tells you this stuff. That's why I'm telling you. But what's even more powerful than knowing why something isn't working is knowing how to make it work despite it. Let me put it more simply than neuroscience. I'm going to give you 2 quick verses that tells you exactly what to do when you're triggered. These verses are from James 1:19 through 20. If you aren't sure how you feel about the Bible speaking into your marriage, be assured this verse is backed up by the research we've been talking about. And it actually makes research way more practical. And if you're like me and you're a follower of Jesus, fortunately for us, this verse isn't optional. So let's try out these few verses. Okay, right now, I want you to imagine your spouse has just triggered you. Don't look at them right now. Look at me. Imagine your spouse has just triggered you. Now I want you to imagine yourself pausing the scene. And now imagine doing what James, the brother of Jesus, instructs us to do. He says this. He says, my dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Now don't miss this. He calls them dear brothers and sisters. James is speaking to a group of new followers of Jesus that he loved and he cared for, and he wanted them to have a right relationship with each other. He writes, dear brothers and sisters, take note of this. Everyone should do this. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. This verse gives us very specific instructions on how to pause. And here is why pausing is so crucial. Let me geek out on you just one more small time. When we are triggered, it takes 6 to 8 seconds for the amygdala to relax enough to get us back to a calm spot. 8 seconds is also the amount of time a bull rider is required to stay on a ride to be scored, which has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. It just gives us a very cool visual to put beside me. Yes, 8 seconds is the pause you need, and watch this. Studies actually show that the time we need to let the amygdala calm down can actually become shorter and shorter as you practice pausing. Yes, we can get better at pausing. Okay, let's take a look at this. The natural order of things is trigger, reaction. The supernatural order of things is trigger, pause, response. This space after being triggered is where relationships are either built or broken. In this space, my friends, is where the magic happens. You may be thinking, wait, I thought the magic happened in the bedroom. And it does. But the magic also happens right here in this pause. We have to create a space after we're triggered. We have to use that space to choose a response versus a reaction. Studies show that couples with the highest level of marital satisfaction use a tool that Dr. John Gottman, marriage researcher, calls a repair attempt. He defines a repair attempt as any statement or action, silly or otherwise, that prevents negativity from escalating out of control. A repair attempt is something happy couples use to keep things from going sour. When one or both of them feel triggered, they do something to pause. Most couples who use repair attempts, they don't even know that term. They don't even choose it. It's just something they happen to do naturally. But for those of us who don't do that naturally, we can choose to implement a repair attempt. Now, repair attempts can be as simple as saying, okay, let me pause. Can I redo that? Let me pause. I'm sorry, I can tell I hurt you. Let me pause. This isn't your problem. This is our problem. Our spouse needs an attempt from us to let them know that we're not trying to attack them. They need to know that we're safe. Whatever your pause is, you need to plan your pause when you're calm. And James gives us really specific pointers on how to learn to pause. They're all happening at once. These are not steps 1, 2, 3. Again, these are all happening at the same time. The first thing he says is this: be quick to listen. When we are triggered, it is so natural to immediately stop listening, to start talking, and to defend ourselves. We're not quick to listen. We're quick to stop listening. At least I am. We're quick to stop hearing what our spouse is trying to tell us. James gave us this amazing advice long before I got geeked out on neuroscience. He says, take a pause and try to hear what the other person is saying. Even if their behavior is wrong or hurtful, try to see through their behavior and see what is really hurting them. Listen to what they're trying to tell you. Their frustrations and their anxieties speak to something in them that matters to them. And this is a space to give them grace. Most of us weren't taught relationship skills growing up. We weren't instructed how to do marriage either. Well, neither was our spouse. And this is the time, this is the space to give them grace, to listen to what they're really trying to say. Maybe you've never really heard them on a specific issue. Or maybe you understand their opinion on this issue like nobody else. But maybe, just maybe, you're wrong. You don't. Maybe you don't understand fully. Maybe there's just one piece of information or hurt that you just don't understand. I saw an amazing illustration of this. One of the things my team and I do is to create small group video series. And one of the series, I told couples that I would be interviewing them, but right before the director said action, I said to them, so I've decided that I'm not going to interview you. I'm leaving. I'm going to let you interview each other. I instructed them to ask their spouse a question and not to have too much comment on what they said. I assured them that they would get their turn when their spouse asked them the same questions. Michael and Shamika were interviewing each other, and the conversation went a little bit like this. She asked him, how can I make our home a better place? He said, when I come home at night, I just need a few minutes to unwind before you and the kids start talking to me. There are times I'm not even in the door good and you're asking questions about the next day. I have to talk to people all day long, so when I get home, I just need a moment. Despite the fact his wife remained calm and had no big response, you could tell she had been triggered. You could see it in her eyes and slightly in her body language. It was now Michael's turn to interview Shamika, to ask her the same questions, which included, how can I make home a better place? She said very calmly, when you come home from a day of being at work, you seem frustrated to see us. Everywhere you go, you're talking, at work, at church, even with strangers. Then you often tell us when you arrive home that you don't have any more words, and that hurts. The reason I asked you questions about the next day is you come in typically late, and I need the answers to make the next day work for our family. He seemed taken back. Off camera, he said to her, oh, honey, I never knew you felt that way. I don't know how I missed that. I'm so sorry. Perfect. This is a great example of what couples can talk about when they aren't mad. So many married people only talk about frustrating things in the middle of frustrating things. They only talk about money when they're frustrated about a surprise purchase on the credit card bill. They only talk about chores when someone has left a big mess. They only talk about sex when the offer has been declined. But when couples' brains and bodies are calm, they can talk. More importantly, they can listen. And don't miss this. The husband in the story I just shared with you was not a bad man. In fact, I intentionally invited him to be a part of the video series because he's an extraordinary man. Well, it's easy to write him off as clueless or insensitive. He's like many of us, no ill intent. He just missed it. His brain and his body weren't on his side when he was triggered by his wife's questions, and he didn't know it. He had been taught how to do his job, but not how to be a husband. Now he knows. Now he can make a different choice. Now he knows to listen when there's a tension. And we can too. I've seen countless couples at marriage retreats and events be able to talk about some very tough things because they aren't in the middle of those things. Their brains are set up to win. More importantly, they insert a pause to allow God a space to help them. But let me put a pin in that and come back to it at the end. It's too important to whiz by. The second thing James says is this: be slow to speak. Okay, don't miss this. If you get this part right, it could revolutionize your relationship. This could be the thing you've been needing to do for 30 years. Married people say to me all the time, just tell me what to do. And I always give them this one piece of advice, especially when it comes to conflict. I say to them, and I say to you, and I say to me, when you are triggered, don't talk. Don't say anything negative with your words or with your body. Studies show that 80% of communication is nonverbal. So when you're triggered, pause, take a breath, and do not talk. I believe people like me who work to help marriages, we learn too much, and we ultimately make marriage way too complicated. This advice is not complicated. When you are triggered, at first, do not talk. Brene Brown, a behavioral researcher, says when we are shamed, don't talk, don't text, don't type, until you allow the logical part of your brain to come back online. Don't address the situation until you have had time to become calmer and remember what you really want for your marriage. One of the most powerful parts of pausing is that it will lead to a better response versus a reaction. The next time you're triggered, imagine me waving my arms like this, saying, don't talk, don't talk, don't talk. But you don't have to imagine me. You can imagine a bear, Mickey Mouse, Dr. Phil, who I resemble more than I'm comfortable with. No matter the mental cue, just remember, when you're triggered, don't talk with your words, your face, or your body. When you're triggered at first, just don't talk. And here's the third thing. James tells us, be slow to become angry. Let me ask you a question. What does anger or frustration look like on you? How do you respond when you're triggered? Are you loud, passive-aggressive, distant, demonstrative, sarcastic? How does anger fit you? What does it look like on you? Because here's the problem. It almost always leads to something going wrong in your marriage. But this isn't what you want. You don't desire tension. None of us desires tension and pain. Most of us don't want to intentionally hurt our spouse. And don't miss that word there, become. This is why pausing is so important. You don't want to become the spouse you don't want to be. You don't want to be the spouse who says whatever they want or acts any way they want when they're angry. That's what we did when we were kids. And I can tell you though, from experience, I can handle anger like a child. But we're all too big for that now. We're big people and we can make a choice. You can choose a response versus a reaction out of anger. You can choose to pause. You can choose to listen, not to speak, and to control your anger. As temperament expert Kathleen Edelman says, you choose the words you use. Yes, you can choose. And here is some even better news. And I've actually saved this to the end because I believe it's the most powerful thing you can do immediately after you're triggered to help you pause. Watch this. James not only gives us very practical wisdom to know how to pause, he gives us a why we should pause. He says, be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because anger does not bring about the righteous life God desires. Righteousness is just a fancy word for saying right living. It's called doing this thing called relationship right. It's about having the relationship God desires for you to have. And I believe that God hardwired into all of us that same desire to do marriage in a way that gives us a home of grace and compassion, laughter, and intimacy. And that is built in part by self-control and implementing the difficult yet simple pause. And one of the greatest things we can leverage during the pause is to pray. Even if you aren't sure how you feel about God, say a prayer in this pause. Maybe you don't know how you feel about God, but God knows how he feels about you. I believe more than anything that inviting God and his ways into your marriage is the most important thing you can do for your marriage, including his wisdom to pause. And I'm not talking about fancy prayers. I'm talking about simple prayers in your mind like, help me, Jesus. More seriously, God, would you please help me to love well right now? Or if you need a really quick prayer, simply pray in your head or out loud when you're alone. God, please make space for grace. My passion on this topic doesn't just come from my years of study and working with couples. My passion for you to get this comes from my own life, my own faith. I learned the unfortunate art of how to verbally defend myself, and not in a good way. And this impacted my marriage right from the start. I was so shocked how quickly I could respond to Nancy in frustration. But I knew I didn't want that for our marriage. So with a lot of prayer and a great counselor, I learned to pause, to be quicker to listen to her, slower to speak, and slower to become angry. Do I get it perfect every time? No. But now I have a why and I have a how to pause. And more importantly, I have learned the power of a really simple prayer. God, give me space for grace. You can choose the same. Some of you may be like me. Maybe you need a counselor's help. There is no shame in that. We all need people in our marriage who want it to win. But it doesn't have to be a counselor. It could be your small group. It could be a coach, a mentor, a best friend. But if you want to get great at pausing, having great people in your team makes it so much easier. For some of you, that pause will need to last 5 seconds. Well, actually 8. For others of you, 5 minutes, and for others of you, 5 hours or longer. But you have to come back. You have to come back with a response and not a reaction. A response that you think about. A response you pray about. A response that draws you together instead of pushing you apart. You can come back and you can ask better questions. You can come back and ask them in a different way. You can come back and talk in a better way, in a way that gives space for grace. And in many situations, just give it up. Just simply forgive it. You could simply say to yourself, I don't need to bring this up. I was just tired. I don't need to bring this up. They were just tired. I don't need to bring this up. This is my issue, not theirs. I don't need to bring this up. They don't have the emotional capacity to deal with it right now. I don't need to bring this up because it simply doesn't matter. I don't need to bring this up because we're wired so differently. We are never going to see eye to eye on this issue. But make no mistake about it, we can decide to keep no records of their wrong. And I'm not talking about stopping communication. I'm talking about grace. I'm talking about picking your battles. I'm talking about pausing to communicate in a way that leads to connection. Learning to pause conflict before it gets out of hand can be a game changer for your marriage. Right now, we're in the middle of some crazy, crazy times. For so many of us, our marriages have never felt so much frustration and tension. So it's understandable if you're struggling. But what if we use this time to practice being a better spouse? Specifically, what if we practice pausing when we're triggered? We've never had more opportunities to get good at it. What if you became a pro at not letting silly fights lead to serious damage? What if your kids saw you model in a healthy way to handle conflict? What if you looked back on this crazy time and said, this was the time we got closer because we learned how to love each other better by simply learning to pause? Come on, people, you know how to pause. You know how to pause Netflix. You know how to pause YouTube. You know how to pause SpongeBob, who demands to be paused. You know how to pause. The pause symbol, it's everywhere. So this week, and hopefully way beyond, when you see that pause symbol, when you use a pause button, remember that pausing is what happy couples do and any couple can learn. You got this. Be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Be quick to pause. Just kidding. See you guys.